Good morning, Ms. Barali.
Good morning, my lord. Our first witness this morning is Mrs. Lynn Pornaro of Disability Equalities Scotland, and her statement reference for the record is SCI WT 0408-501.
Good morning, Ms. Pornaro.
Good morning.
Right. When you're ready, Ms. Barali.
Thank you, my lord. Good morning, Ms. Pornaro. Could you please begin by briefly describing the role and purpose of Disability Equality Scotland and the communities it serves?
Sure. Disability Equality Scotland is a national charity, but we're a national disabled people's organisation. That means we're an organisation that's not just run for disabled people, but we're run by disabled people. We've been established for nearly 23 years now, and we see ourselves as a bit of a bridge between national policy to influence, to inform and to educate oftentimes for services and for policies, and we bring that down to the local levels, being the umbrella organisation for access panels. That's 40 local groups across Scotland at the moment who work to improve accessibility locally. And we take we're membership led, so we have over 1,500 members, reaching approximately 20,000 disabled people regularly across Scotland. We advocate for them, so we listen to their voice, we bring that lived experience into all that we do to help their voices be heard, and to make sure that we can have accessibility as much as possible in Scotland through all aspects, the built environment, in society and communities, so that disabled people are seen and have the same opportunities as non-disabled people.
Thank you. Now, you say in your statement that Disability Equality Scotland wasn't aware of any pre-pandemic planning by the Scottish Government, wasn't consulted or invited to contribute, and nor were the members or representatives of the communities it serves. Can you expand on whether you believe the absence of consultation with DES or other disability organisations affected the Scottish Government's ability to respond inclusively to the pandemic?
So our members tell us, and have done for many, many years, that they feel unheard a lot of time, and not just unheard but unseen. Disabled people have been fighting for their human rights to be realised for many, many years, and unfortunately they still have to continue to do so. And when our members have been consulted in the past, whether it's at Scottish Government level or whether it's local level, they find it's more of a tick box exercise. That lack of disability competence within the Scottish Government and other public bodies is just not acceptable in this era. Disabled people are often thought as an afterthought rather than being included when they're thinking about policy decisions or service design, planning. 1 in 5 of us of a working age here in Scotland are disabled, and that increases to over 1/3 of our population when you include children and older people. So my question back is, how can a government respond inclusively when disabled people are not involved, their representatives are not involved, and when they are involved in small ways, it's a tick box exercise, and they're often they're listened to. There's one person in the room, and then they're overspoken and not considered.
Now, that was pre-pandemic. During the pandemic, what was the nature of DES's engagement with the Scottish Government, and did it change at various stages?
It did. I wasn't part of DES at that point in time, but from I understand DES was initially involved with Scottish Government meetings along with other disabled people's organisations like Inclusion Scotland, Glasgow Disability Alliance. Those were initially to get a kind of pulse point of what disabled people were faced, etc., and they were to be really regularly. They started off kind of weekly, fortnightly, then moved very quickly to monthly, and then kind of just faded out. Des's main engagement was with the Equality Unit of Scottish Government, where we submitted results of all our those touch point parts. We were doing the polls that we had regarding the pandemic as things changed. We put messages out to our members to say, what do you think of this new advice that's been given, or what do you think, how is this working for you with shielding, with face coverings, with being allowed lockdowns allowed out, etc. And obviously we engaged heavily with the face covering exemption team when the physical and digital exemption cards were available for distribution as well. But that was our main contact as far as we're aware during that time.
Thank you. I want to turn to the accessibility of public health information. You carried out a poll in March or April of 2020 in which 18% of respondents said information and guidance wasn't accessible to them. What were the main barriers that they cited?
So the members who indicated their guidance wasn't accessible were facing the same barriers that they face on a daily basis. Lack of alternative formats such as easy read or large print. Everything was online. We went digital first. Digital exclusion amongst disabled people is 60%. So initially briefings didn't have British Sign Language. Then when we look at the actual language, the information that was being shared, it was all very complicated information. Stats were coming out, words that we weren't, as a society, used to hearing or seeing. So for that, a lot of it was complicated. A lot of information was coming out all at once. So that's another barrier for a lot of people. Scottish Government does have its 6 principles of inclusive communication that it established for themselves and public bodies in 2011. And although we, as everybody acknowledges, things were moving really fast, unexpectedly, information was changing at great speeds, etc., not having those principles embedded in the day-to-day workings of the Scottish Government meant they weren't even considered during the pandemic. And when we think about 2011 to 2020, it should have been more inclusive, it should have been more accessible.
Now, you've touched on it there, the absence of BSL at government briefings. How significant was that absence, and what effect did it have on communication and trust in the Scottish Government?
If you're unable to understand the information that's been provided to you, and it's about your health and it's about your wellness and what you can and you can't do, because someone's not considered your language, your first language, you feel often like a second-class citizen. That's how deaf people, BSL users, felt. Do you know, again, the British Sign Language Scotland Act came in 2015. And in 2017, the Scottish Government set out their plan, their national strategy, to, and I quote, make Scotland the best place in the world for BSL signers to live, work, visit and learn. But then in 2020, not just a few months later, but years later, the Scottish Government chose not to provide BSL for briefings. Was it an afterthought? Here we go back to my first point. Members feel, disabled people feel like they're afterthoughts. I really don't think in that impact, for that trust, for that communication, much more needs to be said about that at that time.
And you say in your statement at paragraph 32 that you're not aware of action taken by the Scottish Government to address that issue of almost a fifth of people not being able to access information. Did Des raise these concerns with the Scottish Government at the time? And if so, what was the response?
I didn't work for the organisation. We've not been able to find any evidence that we did or didn't. I'm sure that we did mention it through the contacts that we had and other disabled people's organisations. So I'm not able to really share much more about that.
Thank you. Do you know whether improvements came as the pandemic progressed? Were improvements made?
some improvements were made. Obviously, BSL got put into the daily briefings, etc. Some of the language was simplified as well. I think that was partly because we started to become a bit more aware of what the language was and what all these terms and medical formats were there. However, there was still the clarity that was required. Often people were getting a letter sent out if they were shielding, for example. It was 4 or 5 pages long. It was text heavy. So their actual communication needs weren't necessarily considered. When you look back now at the information that was sent out to people that were shielding public messages, etc., you can see there was a lot of information that had to come out to people, but it was quite complicated, and tables were put into online and in letters, etc., and you had to try and work out, is this my category, am I down here, but if I'm not that and I'm here, and work out what am I meant to be doing or what am I not meant to be doing accordingly. So yes, improvements did happen, but there still wasn't that real consideration for individuals who required braille information, audio, kind of maybe had even, cognitive impairments, dyslexia, that kind of thing, but it's all text heavy.
Thank you. I want to move on to speak about the impact on healthcare and isolation. You say that in another poll, 49% of respondents say they experienced cancelled medical appointments or hospital appointments. What consequences did that have on their health and well-being?
That had a huge impact on individuals. Members have told us they felt isolated. They were unsure when they were going to be able to see a medical professional. Again, a lot of disabled people have more medical appointments than non-disabled people for obvious reasons. Some had already waited a long, long time before their appointment was due, and then that delay exacerbated symptoms and concerns that they had about how they were going to be able to live their lives with these issues ongoing, and obviously affected their mental health, as I think it did everybody. The ongoing effect of that was that some treatments that might have been able to have been utilised in a preventative or in an early situation didn't happen. And then when the appointments did come through, it was more invasive procedures that needed to be taken to support people. And additional issues arose as a result of not seeing their GP or medical professionals at that point in time.
Thank you. And other than experiencing cancellations, can you provide more detail on specific challenges faced by disabled people in accessing health and social care during the pandemic?
So, from a healthcare point of view, all of the above, but some people, we moved to the kind of near me video calls. Some people were said, well, yes, you can speak to your GP, or yes, you can speak to your consultant, or what have you, but it must be through that way, not considering that often those individuals were sitting with masks on because they were in the health environment, and therefore people that lip read had hearing impairments, they couldn't understand. There was often situations where, from the medical side, the connection wasn't secure enough or strong enough, so therefore you had intermittent audio going in and out, or even the calls dropping often in that case. Again, when you're faced with, you can have an online phone conversation, however, again, a lot of people don't have the ability to connect that way, and if they do, they might need support to be able to access the online system, and that may mean that they were their privacy was taken away from them, where they're discussing medical conditions with their doctor, with a personal assistant, a support worker, a family member in the room to support them to do that digitally, which again is not necessarily how they would act, if they were there in person. professionals were doing their best. Nobody can dispute how well the medical professional did during the pandemic. But again, they didn't have that training to say, don't look away or come away from the microphone when you're doing an online video call because people can't hear you. They perhaps were covering their face, again, for people who were lip read down, that kind of thing, if they didn't have a mask on. And so that was just on the medical side of things. On social care, hit really, really hard. I was actually working for another disabled people's organisation in healthcare, social care at that point in time, based in the Lothians. Social care stopped for people. Day centres closed down. Some of them have never reopened. Personal assistants were just like gold dust. A lot of them were affected by COVID themselves. In the Lothians, a lot of personal assistants were university students and they'd all gone home, didn't come back. Some EU citizens went back home to support their families. Local authorities were in crisis themselves. That was 4 local authorities that I personally worked with. They were all in crisis. They didn't have the opportunity to assess anybody new who would normally be requiring social care or a change in their social care, unless it was critical, and that usually meant somebody was coming out of hospital, and even then it was no real person-centred support was put in. It was a short package just to get the person home, with the intention that it would be re-looked at within 4 to 6 weeks, and that didn't happen. Years later, people were still on that emergency care package that perhaps didn't suit their needs. Disabled people who required social care couldn't get through to anybody on the phone. Some local authorities use their contact centre staff basically to say, unless you're in crisis and you're coming out of hospital, you'll not get any help, and hang up on people. That's real life stories. Communication was horrendous. People didn't know what they were supposed to do, where to turn for support, leaving again people isolated, socially excluded and very, very lonely. If you need support to get outside, to get up in the morning, to live your life, and that support suddenly disappears, your 1 hour a day that we got initially, that we could get outside, get some fresh air, it disappears as well. And to see somewhere different, so to be stuck to your own place a lot of time, day by day. And then, of course, those individuals who were shielding, isolating for even longer. Social care, we've got to remember, isn't just about getting your social care needs met. If you're seeing somebody for 15 minutes a day to get you up in the morning, 15 minutes a day to put you to bed, that's sometimes people's packages. That may be your only communication and socialisation with someone else that you're seeing. When that disappears, and in a time where there was a lot of fear-mongering going around, all you're hearing about is death and illness, save the NHS. There's lots of disabled people that were left going, well, who's saving me? Mental health is commonly known as being increased within disabled people. Sometimes mental health impairments is their disability. Other times it is their other impairments that cause their mental health to be affected. And as much as we know that mental health for everybody was affected, there was nowhere to turn for people. And those that did manage to get access to support maybe were offered an appointment that wasn't online. These services were not designed for the individual's impairments. So the buildings were inaccessible at times, the locations, the timing of the appointments, none of that was taken into consideration. So there was a huge impact. And when we think that social care is for disabled people, it affected them all.
Now, you say in paragraph 95 of your statement that we asked if members had a network of people who could support them in supplying them with food and essential items. 67% said they did. However, that means 33% did not. So what happened to them and how did they manage? We do not have that information, unfortunately. I just wondered, did you even anecdotally hear anything about what happened to a third of people who didn't have access to food or other support.
Yeah. So a lot of people leaned on unpaid carers. That could have been family members, friends, neighbours, or even strangers. Local community groups pulled together to support people. Organisations like Glasgow Disability Alliance changed their services and ended up giving out thousands and thousands of meals regularly to their members. Even disabled people themselves started supporting disabled people. Some people ended up in hospital. Some people ended up for days and days in their bed because there was nobody there to support them to get up or to support them to eat, etc. And unfortunately, some people died. Not because of having COVID, but because of the effects of that isolation and lack of support. People's care packages were reduced, wiped out, and then they had the awful effect afterwards that local authorities said, well, you've not needed this care package for a period of time, so we'll just remove that out of your package, because unpaid carers had supported people. Packages automatically reduced, day services that haven't started again. Peer support was a lifeline for a lot of disabled people, whether that was in groups or individual calls, and that's the importance of having disabled people's organisations who know their members. Often we know our members better than social work does or the community does as well.
You mentioned there that unpaid carers picked up some of the help requirements and that then on that basis care packages were cancelled. Were these unpaid carers people who typically worked, and were they able to help because of furlough and other work disruptions? I'm wondering what happened when they had to return to work and there was no care package either.
So, yeah, a lot of people they were on furlough, or they were working from home perhaps, and they had that little bit extra capacity to support their family members, their friends, their neighbours, etc. And then when that returns back again, that unfortunately means a disabled person is left without the support that they actually need. And I hate to say that that's what the reality is for a lot of people day by day, never mind from the pandemic. So we've had people who've had to, as a result of that, the additional stress of having to reduce your job hours perhaps to support because there is no social care and it's difficult enough to get it in the first place, never mind to get it reinstated again with regards to it. We've had people who've had to give up working completely and utterly, and that effect unfortunately is carrying on today. It's getting harder and harder for people to access self-directed support, social care, and packages are getting reduced automatically daily. In that regard, it's the fight that disabled people have been fighting all the time. It didn't get any better during the pandemic, and it's not got any better after that.
Thank you. I want to move on briefly to DNA CPR issues. You mention in paragraph 45 of your statement that some people have been proactively targeted for DNA CPR without discussion, and it's a quote from one of your members. Have you been able to gather the impact from members, to gather information, from members about the impact of these sort of spontaneous contacts, and could you tell us about that?
Sure. People were petrified to go into hospital because they didn't know if they were going to come out again. At the time of the pandemic, especially because everybody was feeling that way, but even more so with the fact of would they get the support they needed to survive if it was against them or what was seen as a non-disabled person. So we had an individual who was in hospital themselves with COVID in a COVID ward, and a confused dementia patient who had COVID came onto the ward in the middle of the night after being in A&E for hours and hours and hours. They were confused and scared and very unwell. when staff were booking this individual in, so not the person who had COVID who shared the story, they overheard the question being asked, "What do you want us to do if your heart stops beating?" The patient said that she didn't understand the question. This was somebody that was in their late 80s. The response was, "Well, you don't want us to break your ribs just to get your heart working again, do you? You'll end up in a lot of pain." And the patient, confused, unwell, is going, "No, no more pain. Don't want any more pain." So a DNA CPR was added to their file. There was no discussion with family. There was no understanding that this was confusing for the individual, who's well known that dementia can especially in the evenings and during the night after what they'd experienced. This wasn't someone, there was no consideration if this was someone who actually had the capacity to understand what they were answering and what the implications were there. There's a fear in the disabled community that should they catch COVID now, because it's still around, or any other infection or disease, they won't receive the same consideration as a non-disabled person. We're still hearing stories of this happening today, not related to COVID, but still happening. And it's not about necessarily an individual in a life or death situation. It's someone who's relatively healthy, but who caught an infection, etc., and is seen as old, is seen as disabled, and therefore their life isn't worth that of someone who doesn't appear disabled. Now, that's the perception disabled people have in there. And we know that proportionally there was more disabled people died as a result of COVID than non-disabled people as well. Now, that's not saying that that's because they weren't treated fairly or what have you, but when it comes down to what we see evidential during the pandemic, what's been shared with us, been overheard, and what we're still seeing today, does make you question, if you're a disabled person, are you going to get the same care and attention as what somebody else is?
I want to ask you now about intersectionality and the disproportionate impacts. You say at paragraph 48, the intersectional group that experienced the greatest disproportionate impacts was the old and disabled group, particularly if they required hospital care. And you've spoken about that just now in your last answer. But are you able to tell us a bit more about other intersectional groups and the impacts on them, examples of other intersectionality issues?
Yeah. So a lot of that was prejudgments, and it's a society that unfortunately we do live in with regards to that. So we've got a number of what's the word I'm looking for? Statements from individuals that were shared with regards to it. You know, people having lost confidence when receiving it, to be asked to forgo treatment in favour of a younger, presumably non-disabled person. That was a phone call that somebody received just because they were older. Community nurses asking if they should be resuscitated. 68 years of age, fit, reasonably healthy for that kind of age. Why would you be even asked that? An individual at that point in time didn't have COVID, wasn't unwell in any other way, but it was almost like they were going through a tick box exercise of, well, if you're over a certain age, if you do catch COVID, what do you want us to do? Because we're not going to wait until you do catch it and then ask you. We're going to, what have you. People were nasty online. We know that online discrimination and abuse happens. But during the pandemic as well, disabled people were targeted even more for that onlineness. Regards to being told that they were the ones that were sharing and spreading COVID, that they really are just a drain on society and therefore they should catch COVID and that would free up space for non-disabled people to have access to ventilation support if it was, or to have access to benefits or jobs, etc. So that was all going on for disabled people at the same time. And bearing in mind, disabled people face that kind of thing on a day-by-day basis anyway. But even more so, that prejudgment, that was the big thing, really, of if you are older, if you're disabled, your life isn't as worth as much as someone who's younger, who's healthier, who's not disabled. And quite frankly, there is thousands and thousands and thousands of disabled people that are actually healthier than not some non-disabled people when we look at that category. So just because you're disabled doesn't mean to say that you are unhealthy, doesn't mean to say that you wouldn't be able to survive COVID. I did. Doesn't mean to say that life is worth less. And that's the perception that comes across to disabled people. So I'm not going to sit here and say that is what community nurses and GP practices and our medical professional are believing. But that's the perception that comes across, and that's where the trust, that's where the fear comes from for disabled people.
Thank you. I want to move on to digital exclusion. You mentioned that 60% of disabled people are digitally excluded. Could you tell us, please, for disabled people, what are the key drivers of that digital exclusion, and also what impact did that then have during the pandemic on their ability to work, access services, engage in polling, such as your organisation's polling even, and to even have social connection?
So disabled people don't often get the same opportunities as non-disabled people for education at times, for work experience, for training, etc. Therefore, those digital skills are not always developed in the same way as they would for non-disabled people. So there is that. There's a confidence around digital usage as well, and they might know how to use digital equipment, but they don't have the confidence clearly to do that, especially when it's coming towards like health and understanding that. But technology is not always impairment friendly. We know that around there as well. So we have the situation where there's lots of text heavy. I'm just looking at the screen there. It's very text heavy. So someone who has dyslexia or visual impairment would find that quite confusing. Someone with learning disability, someone who is neurodiverse, and someone who's even just a bit tired would find that quite heavy to read. And if you're having to read through that kind of thing over and over and over again to find the information that you need, that's really challenging as well. Sometimes the equipment used to make digital accessible is hugely expensive. Screen readers, for example, are over £700. To translate a document like this that could go into Braille so someone could use that, we're looking at £5,000 plus. Poverty is a huge factor. So even if individuals had equipment that they could use to get onto the internet, does not mean to say that they can afford the Wi-Fi to come into their home or a mobile data on a mobile phone, etc. And then we bring into all the other aspects where you might need somebody to access the internet for you. Perhaps you've got mobility issues, perhaps you've not got dexterity issues, etc. And then when you do get on, you can't understand it, whether it's colours, the contrast is not good enough, it's just text heavy, there's no captions on videos, etc. Or if you're using a screen reader, the actual screen isn't designed for that, so you don't know what information you're getting and it's all muddled up. So there's a variety of reasons why disabled people are digitally excluded.
Now, I'm not sure whether you're able to help with my next question, if you're part of the organisation or know what happened, but you mentioned in your statement that there were issues with the NHS Scotland COVID status app, that people with visual impairments found it difficult to navigate. Do you know whether DES raised accessibility issues with that app with the Scottish Government and whether anything happened as a result?
Again, we weren't able to find any evidence to say we did or we didn't, so no.
Oh, that's okay, thank you. You mentioned earlier, and you say in your statement, that Des was approached by the Scottish Government to support the face covering exemption card project in September 2020, and that you distributed around 250,000 cards to disabled people. Can you tell us about the process of distributing those cards and any challenges that you encountered?
Sure. So Des set up a specific website for the face exemption cards at the request of Scottish Government. People could go on and order their cards, physical card, or download an online one, but we also had a dedicated phone line for people who couldn't access that digitally, so that they could call us up and request one through. I think the biggest challenge that everybody was unexpected at the time was when that went live, the influx of requests from people. It wasn't just, could I get a card, though? They were sharing stories where they were being challenged, and what about in certain situations, what was happening. And we employed someone at Des to deal with the physical sending out of the cards, etc. But that ended up with all staff stopping all other work, basically, just to spend weeks and weeks and weeks daily stuffing envelopes, addressing them, posting them, etc. out for people. As we said, over 250,000 cards were distributed. So I suppose the main challenges were the volume of that for a small organisation, and perhaps not thinking from government side or even from Des's side just how many people would actually want one of these cards, etc. And then, of course, once the cards got distributed, etc., they contacted us back when they were being ignored. The cards weren't good enough to give them the exemption from a face covering when public bodies refused it and they had a blanket coverage, or retail premises, etc. We did move to just a download-only option in late 2022 as the requests for physical cards actually decreased and people wanted them digitally. But that closed in 2023. But even though individuals up to the day that it closed were still downloading cards, over 700 a week, we weren't sure though whether that was people who maybe had a card previously and they had replaced their device, so they needed an update, etc., or perhaps they had a physical card and they wanted to move to a digital card, etc. But it was smaller numbers over time, and it was the government's decision to close that down as well. Ours.
You mentioned there that even with the card, some venues refused entry or service. What, if anything, do you think could have been done differently by the government to ensure that didn't happen?
I think from the government's point of view, we had the message of you must wear, it was compulsory, you had to wear a face covering. And then that changed to you're advised to. There was no real talk about initially that some people might not be able to wear a face mask for a variety of different reasons. The lessons could be that we need to be talking as a society about disability. Now, we shouldn't need to, because we should all be seen as individuals, citizens of Scotland, all living and working and socialising together. But because we've got this prejudgment that disabled people are a variety of different names, lazy, a drain on society, not worth much, not going to amount to much, etc., we've got to change that attitude. And that comes from our leadership to begin with, which is our government. They need to be thinking about, again, when they're putting messages out, you must wear a face mask. Everybody must wear a face mask covering. they need to be thinking, right, what about those people that can't? And how do we get across, not just a case of, because that eventually did come, there will be people who cannot wear and they shouldn't be discriminated against, but not a case of there will be some people, but actually thinking about them from the beginning, and to clearly state that just by not wearing it doesn't mean to say that they can't have access to services. There was too many blanket policies of no face mask or no face covering, no entry. And that wasn't just like private companies, that was some medical practices, some hospitals, some local authorities that did that as well, restricting people's movement and opportunities to live their life. And when you consider that for a lot of disabled people, going out for the first time after many months, going somewhere for perhaps that they've lost their confidence, they've had challenges about how they could get there because the buses were reduced, the amount of people that were allowed on buses, for example, were reduced, all for protection. And they've stepped out after months of being stuck at home, and they want to just go and buy some of their necessities or pick a prescription up or something like that, and they're refused access. We've heard from many people who said, it took a lot for me to go out, and then when I faced that, it's now, I'm not going to go back out again because I don't know what I'm going to face, I don't know where I'm going to be allowed to go, and then that's going to isolate them even more and affect their mental health, etc.
And you, on that thing, you mentioned in your statement that 6.4% of disabled people had been victims of hate crimes related to the exemptions. Can you tell us about the nature of the hate crimes they reported, and whether the authorities took any action to address the themes that were emerging? So,
disability hate crime, like any other hate crime, it varies from name-calling, spitting, shoving, pushing, online comments, and to much worse. None of it's acceptable at any time, but during the pandemic it seemed that non-disabled people or those people that were in power felt that they had a right, especially on public transport, to impart this kind of hatred and negativity onto disabled people. So we did have people that were told, you're not getting on this bus because you're the one that's spreading this virus around, etc. We had one incident where somebody had called a bus down and the bus had stopped and slowed down, the doors were opened, and as the person moved to get on the bus, they were told, you're not getting on this bus because you'll just spread that all around, and drove off, leaving that person standing in the middle of the road wondering, can they get on the next bus? What's actually just happened? I'm not spreading it around, am I? What's going on here? Isolated and lonely as well. We had other situations where people were getting, if they were on public transport, they were getting hurled abuse within the transportation vehicle, and then they were getting followed when they got off. And that continued, and they were trying, following them. People waiting for, to go to the bank, etc. So in queues, it wasn't just on transportation. They were getting pushed out the way, they were getting ignored, they were spat on. And unfortunately, disabled people face this a lot day by day. The Hate Crime Act hadn't actually been implemented at that point in time. And when disabled people did report these incidences, often they were faced with, well, what do you want me to do about it? Or I can't get involved because I've got a bus to drive, or and it wasn't just people that you would maybe expect to support people, drivers, people who are in places, bank tellers, etc. The general public as well didn't want to help. And that just isolated disabled people even more and made them go away from using public transport and going out and about in their communities.
Thank you. I want to move on to accessing vaccination and testing centres. Now, you mention in your statement issues around the letters received for vaccinations, and you've told us about the communication issues with letters that were received, and you mentioned a particular issue with vaccination letters were the best route to a vaccination centre. But I want to ask you what specific barriers disabled people faced in actually attending the centres, both en route and in the centres themselves, both in testing centres and vaccination centres. What issues did they encounter?
So I suppose the best way would be to describe an experience that someone had that we heard about. Bearing in mind the message out to disabled people, older people, especially those that were getting vaccinated first on the shielding list, etc. The message we heard was, if you caught COVID, you're going to die. Right? So that already brings up that anxiety around that. So one instance, an individual was asked to go to their local community hospital for their vaccination. So they get the letter and they turn up. They're already anxious because if I don't get this vaccination, I'm going to die if I catch COVID. There were no signs placed around the community hospital and the car park. There's no information on that standard letter of where to actually go apart from the community hospital. There was no people around to guide anyone. So they went to the main reception where you would normally go if you were going for any other reason to book in for an appointment. This individual had mobility issues, so already parking even from the accessible space to the main reception was a strain for them. And when they arrived there, they were told that they shouldn't be there, but they should be right round the other end of the hospital, and they need to go to another entrance and move all the way around, etc. There was no support for the person, there was no wheelchairs, and they've already pushed themselves not to be late, because this was an older person and they've been brought up, don't be late for your appointment, etc. They decided that they needed to move even further and faster, and they ended up falling and was left lying on the ground for about 30 minutes before someone else who was contending for a vaccination kind of came wandering round, because they'd been told to go that way as well. They got some help, and the message they got was, well, 30 minutes isn't too long for people to wait after they've been falling, as we're all really busy with the vaccinations.
Thank you. Now, I want to move on to long COVID. You say in your statement that we conducted a poll with our members asking if they thought long COVID should be considered a disability under the Equality Act 2010. 89% of respondents said yes. What are your views on recognition of long COVID as a disability, and what practical impact would that have on affected individuals?
So our members said yes, as you've shared, and personally I agree. According to the Equality Act, a person has a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment, and that impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the individual's ability to carry out their normal day-to-day life. Long COVID is debilitating. It's nobody's fault. But I'm going to speak from my own personal experience. I'm in
Lord, I understand we're ready to proceed again. If you could please continue to answer the question.
Long COVID is debilitating. And from personal experience myself, I'm in year 3 of long COVID. It's created more disabled people in many ways, and the symptoms are vast. Social isolation, pain, fatigue, nosebleeds, headaches, cognitive reduction, breathing issues, heart issues, vascular conditions, mobility issues, anxiety, mental health deterioration, alopecia, mast cell activation, post-exertional malaise. Those are all my symptoms, and it goes on and on. Life has totally changed. Not being able to do the normal day-to-day activities that you would normally do in your life. Cancelling events at the last minute because you can't open your eyes or deal with the noise or even listen to someone speaking to you. Spending hours and hours on medical devices to help you breathe and medication counters that look like at your own pharmacy. Long COVID is both physical and mental. It's substantial, and it has a long-term adverse effect on your normal day-to-day lives and activities. If we can't recognise that long COVID exists, it's nobody's fault, but it's real, and that our government and our medical people will recognise it fully, then support, funding, research can be provided. Right now, people are refused adult disability payment because they just have long COVID. People are refused blue badges because, well, you can walk, and you just have a bit of fatigue. People are left out to find ways to support themselves and each other. The impact on family and friends and neighbours has been dramatic. Self-confidence disappears. The willingness to fight for life becomes too tiring at times. We're failing all of those with long COVID, and it's not going away because COVID is still around.
Thank you. Now, I just have an eye on time, and I wonder, given the time, whether there's anything that we've not covered today that you would like to touch on, or anything that we have covered that you would particularly like to emphasise?
I think the main thing is, going forward, we need to learn lessons, and that's what this inquiry is about. It's about learning lessons, but there's no point just identifying the lessons and then not doing anything about it. One of the things that needs to be improved is disability competence within our government and within our public bodies and within society. And a lot of people ask, well, what's the difference between being aware of disability and disability competence? Disability awareness is being aware that disabled people are out there, that exists, and some adjustments need to be made, but it's a one-size-fits-all. And usually, if it is training, it's a one-day or a half-day training course delivered by a non-disabled person without lived experience coming into it. Disability competence, however, is not a training course. It might start as that, but we would say it's disability quality training delivered by disabled people sharing lived experience, not focusing on one impairment or condition. But that competence is built up over time by being inquisitive, keeping disabled people a front focus, taking a human rights and a person-centred approach to making decisions, not doing things as a tick box exercise, but to actually start engaging with disabled people and their organisations. Understanding that disabled people's support doesn't look cost effective on paper, but disabled people can and do contribute to society. 1 in 5 of us here are disabled people. MSPs, lawyers, judges, CEOs, teachers, scientists, NHS staff, business entrepreneurs, taxi and bus drivers, retail staff, hairdressers and more. We all have a place and we all can contribute to our society. Our government is working for all the people of Scotland, but it needs to make sure that it works for all the people in Scotland all of the time. We just want to have the same equality and equity as non-disabled people have, and not to have to fight for it whether we're facing a pandemic or not.
Thank you very much. I don't have any further questions.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, Mrs. Pornaro.
Thank you.
We'll take a break now until 11:15.
Thank you.
Now, good morning, Mr Dunlop.
Morning, my lord. This morning, the final witnesses are Ms Miller and Miss Graham of PAMIS. Both have given evidence in the past, so that will enable me to essentially run through things perhaps a bit more quickly.
Very good. Good morning, ladies.
Morning.
Right, you're familiar with what's going to happen, so I'll just tell Mr Dunlop to get on with it.
Thank you, my lord. Good morning. You're both here today to give evidence on behalf of the organisation PAMIS. As I said, I think you've given evidence now on 3 occasions. Is that? Yes. It's a joint statement on this occasion, so what I will do when I'm asking questions, I'll direct them to one of you, but if one of the other is better placed to answer the question, please just jump in and answer on their behalf. You provide us with a background. I don't propose to go through that, given your earlier evidence. At paragraph 9, you go on to tell us... Sorry, you should have your statement in front of you. I should have checked that. Yes. And I suppose I should have asked you, this is a joint statement prepared by both of you. You've had an opportunity to read it, and it represents your evidence to the inquiry today, along with your oral evidence. At paragraph 9 of that statement, you tell us there were inadequate attempts to ensure that persons with PMLD were supported, particularly in residential settings. I mean, Ms Miller, can you just, when you talk about residential settings, can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yes, I think that was where a lot of confusion came up, because there are different types of accommodation that people with a profound learning multiple disability might be living at. Some of that is where they have their own tenancy. All of them will require 24-hour support. None of the group that we support can live independently. But it could be their own tenancy, it could be in a group home. Some people were in care homes. Very few of ours were in care homes. But so there's a range of residential settings, and some people were living at home with families as well.
And there's those different settings, but what's the... You say there was inadequate attempts. Does that mean that the guidance wasn't geared towards the different types, or what was the actual problem?
I mean, there was very early on, we talked about the issues about restricted visiting, and I think for a long time the guidance was given that looked as though people living in supported accommodation should be working on the same rules as though living in care home. And I remember being very excited when Open with Care was finally finalised, and then to discover that actually care homes were totally separated from supported accommodation, by which time we'd gone down into another lockdown. So people that should have been able to have access in supported accommodation didn't get it because they were using the same roles as care homes. And then when you were allowed to go in, we were in another lockdown. So it was a further extended period where families didn't get in to see their sons or daughters.
Okay. And in terms of that generic advice or guidance, who issued that, do you know? That
came from the Scottish Government, and we were part of a group that has gone on to develop Anne's Law, the Open with Care. So it came out from the government, and then, you know, as we moved further on, there was guidance, I think, for residential care, for group homes, but it was really difficult to keep up to date with all of that. And even if you did then highlight it, I think there was real confusion within the sector about which rules they should be following.
Thank you. And in terms of, I appreciate there'll be a spectrum, but in terms of persons with PMLD in residential settings, out with the family home, let's put it that way, so let's use the kind of generic umbrella of residential settings. At the outset of the pandemic, there was obviously less family visits. Did those persons understand why there was less family visits?
Well, no, they didn't, but no, I'll pass to you.
No, I'll comment on that, because my daughter was in one of those residential settings, and what happened was that everything closed down, you know, overnight, and as family carers we were allowed no access whatsoever, without any particular explanation or clarification as to why that would be, and no idea about how open-ended that might be, how long it would be for. So people with profound multiple learning disabilities have, well, as the name suggests, they have a profound learning disability, and so their ability and capacity to understand what was happening to them was very much compromised, because they it's structure and routine and patterns and consistency that gives meaning to their lives. So when COVID started, that was one of the things that they lost immediately. And of course, the other thing that they lost was access to the people who could understand them best, and that would be family carers. So in our situation, we weren't allowed to visit my daughter, and she wasn't allowed to visit us, and that carried on for quite a number of months. So and her situation was typical. So it wasn't any different from anybody else, but the lack of understanding on their part and the lack of communication with them in any meaningful way was something that then seriously impacted on their mental well-being, their emotional well-being, physical, cognitive, every aspect of their life. And it's not an exaggeration to say that many of them still are experiencing that 5 years on.
Well, that's what I was going to actually ask next. In terms of, I understand that would have been very upsetting at the time, but I just wondered if there was any long-term consequences of that. So I think you've possibly answered the question, but is your evidence that individuals who suffered from that loss of contact from family haven't gone back to the way they were pre-pandemic?
Yeah. No. Sorry, yeah, that is absolutely the case, and actually many of for a person with profound learning disability, because of that degree of learning disability, many of the skills that they develop over the years have been the result of many years of input from families and others. But those skills they disappear much more quickly than it takes to establish them, and so lots of those skills will have gone, and it's unlikely that they will ever get those back. But there was also, because of the lack of input from allied health professionals and other medical professionals, their physical health wasn't being taken care of either. So lots of them will have developed physical problems that will either have taken or will take many years to resolve, or won't ever be resolved, and as a result, for some of them, they ended up not surviving at all.
Okay. And in terms of, we're talking about persons with multiple learning difficulties, I mean, what age spectrum are we talking about here? Is it literally 18 to 80, or is it?
Well, it's zero.
Right.
I mean, and for our group, for them to live into later adulthood, I mean, they are now, partly because of real interventions by family carers around, for example, postural care. But no, I mean, we talked before about having a child, during COVID that had a profound disability must have been incredibly impactful as well.
Okay, thank you. Ms Miller, at paragraph 11 of the statement, you mention a discussion with the Scottish Government about your concerns about how resources were being focused on hospitals. Without naming any particular names, I wonder if you could indicate what your concerns were.
Yes, I mean, very rapidly, and we recognise that it was a unique situation, but particularly the allied health professions were drawn into moving into acute hospitals. And I think the example I gave was once on Twitter, seeing a very senior speech and language therapist being used as somebody to welcome people into an acute hospital. And my concern was that actually the people they were leaving behind, particularly our group, who really required that input, and families were desperate for input to understand what they needed to be doing when they were the sole carers at home, was lost because people were being sent into other areas and in reality into other areas where they wouldn't necessarily have the skills and they'd need to be upskilled. But that left a population disregarded, and I mean, we felt very strongly that that was a group that weren't as valued, and so their input in some areas, was reduced to nothing. Other areas that didn't happen, and we worked very closely with some allied health professions in one local authority area, where their commitment was still to support those families. And but for some families there was absolutely nothing, except actually for the support that we try to offer through workshops online.
And you mention all that at paragraph 13 of your statement. You also mention at paragraph 13 that you spoke to a mental welfare commissioner about support with people with PMLD required when going into an acute service. What particular issues was it that you were raising?
I'm going to pass that to
Yeah,
Pam.
that was me, and it was, and as given in previous evidence, we were arguing about the need for appropriate hospital pathways for inter-acute hospitals for people with PMLD, and as part of that, I'd had correspondence with the Mental Welfare Commission, and they were very, very supportive and agreed with the point that we were making, but had to be withdrawn, fairly early on in that correspondence, to be taken back into an acute hospital service. So they were withdrawn from the Mental Welfare Commission. So it was very difficult to be able to find somebody to talk to about the generality of the issues rather than the specifics.
These conversations that you're having out with pandemic, would you be speaking to the same types of individuals, professionals in the course of, a non-pandemic world?
Yes, yeah.
And did you find it more difficult to, I suppose, engage with them, those professionals, during the pandemic as opposed to pre-pandemic?
I think nationally, at a Scottish Government level, it was easier for some of the professionals, and certainly that whole relationship with the civil servants and with there were lead nurses, learning disability nurses, that it was far easier to get hold of and to get advice. But I think locally it became very confusing because people had disappeared, actually, and some of those people that disappeared have never come back.
And I think that's absolutely true. Particularly in terms of medical professionals, that it was almost impossible to get somebody, it was impossible to get a GP or an allied health professional or somebody to actually, getting in touch with them at all, never mind getting them to come out and have a look. And I think that's what has exacerbated the deterioration in the general health of people with PMLD because of that difficulty. But I mean, the same applies to social work. It was almost impossible to get in touch with a social worker. In fact, it was almost impossible to get in touch with anybody to provide any sort of information or advice at all. And my feeling is that probably the only organisation that was doing that was PAMIS. For our community, anyway.
And in terms, that's the difficulty, contacting GPs, social workers within local authorities. Is there, moving forward in terms of may assist the inquiry, is there something you think or say could have been done differently?
I think data was an incredibly difficult problem, and I was really reassured to find just this week actually where we're looking at how people are coded with GPs, because I know in the early stages, there was a learning disability diagnosis, but it didn't actually highlight the other areas of complexity that individuals had. I think having coding and data that's available to health professionals, but also to social work going forward will really improve. And I think there is an effort certainly being made to develop that. But the lack of data has been an ongoing issue. And I think during COVID, it became a real barrier for our families.
And can you, I'm sure it's my ignorance, but by data, what do you actually mean? Do you mean a breakdown of the particular learning difficulties, is that?
Yeah, and understanding who these people are. I mean, when we were looking at the shielding list, so many of our families weren't on the shielding list because they hadn't had their, there was a list of 6 of underlying conditions. Lots of ours had 2 or 3 of those, but those in a GP, they were just told that they had a learning disability, and none of those conditions were highlighted. So families were finding themselves not on the shielding list when they really should have been, not getting the support when they should have been. And I mean, I remember having to ask for advice about that, and quite often families were then having to go to the health board to ask the health board to ask the GPs to put them on a list. So it's that data about, because learning disabilities is a very broad spectrum, and our group have very, very specific needs within that spectrum.
And I guess it's relevant to say that it's not just a question of the profound learning disability, although that is a major issue, but it's also that many of our group have very, very complex medical needs as well, that require invasive procedures and all sorts of things, or have very complex epilepsy. And that was another service that disappeared because those people were pulled off to do other duties as well.
And could I just say, I think the big issue for that is that you don't know what you don't know. And I think all the way along, I guess our problem was that people that were making decisions hadn't thought about the complexity. I mean, they're an invisible group. They're often not out in the community. So if you've never met somebody with a profound learning and multiple disabilities, you maybe won't realise just how intense that caring role, how important it is that they get the right interventions. And so because they were invisible, we feel that there were decisions that were made that completely were inappropriate.
Did your organisation or PAMIS attempt to do anything to address that, either with the Scottish Government or at more local level?
Well, yes. Yeah, I mean, I often think that we're doing quite well, and then you run into people that have never heard of us or never heard of that group. So, yeah, I mean, we were heard within the Learning Disability and Mental Health Directorate and had a voice there as well. But I think again, it's about having to take the time to understand that group. I mean, locally, we do work with local authorities. We have lots and lots of students on placement in the hope that we can grow the next generation. But we're quite a small organisation. Our biggest thing is changing place toilets, and that now is really engaging people. It's not our biggest thing, but it is probably the most high-profile thing. And once people begin to have conversations, they begin to understand what you're talking about. But but sometimes I think you understand and you forget that other people might never have met somebody.
Did you have any involvement, and we'll come on to the changing place toilets, you deal with that later in your statement. Did you, or through PAMIS, have any involvement on groups that were set up by the Scottish Government as a result of the pandemic?
So yes, we were involved in quite a lot of groups. I mean, we would meet very regularly with the Learning Disability and Autism sort of leadership group that was run by that Mental Health Directorate, civil servants, and that was incredibly supportive. We were part of an Inspiring Scotland portfolio that also fed into groups, and then we started sitting on national groups like the Open with Care group. I'm trying to think of any others, but there was a group that were looking when they reduced the vaccinations and the high priority register. Our civil servants tried to get us involved in as much as possible, and actually we tried to elbow in on anything that we could to try and raise the issues of this group.
And by elbowing in, did you make a difference, do you think?
Well, I remember at the last time sometimes we think we have, and then is it worth the paper that it's written on? I
think we have. I think we have because actually PAMIS now has a significantly higher profile within and out with the Scottish Government than it did at that time. And I think a lot of that is tantamount to the work that Jenny and other PAMIS colleagues did in terms of attending lots of meetings and making a really significant contribution at those meetings. And so many more people know who PAMIS is now than certainly at the beginning of the pandemic.
Thank you. Moving on to paragraph 20 of your statement, you speak very highly of the Imagination Toolkit resource developed during the pandemic. Could you tell us, I suppose, firstly, what is the toolkit?
Yeah, so PAMIS, very core to what we do is use multisensory storytelling as a means to help people make sense of the world that they live in, particularly when you've got a very profound learning disability. And so this was an attempt to try to explain to people who really didn't understand what was happening to them what was going on. So using story and narrative to help them explore their emotions as well. But it was also actually a tool to try and help support the care staff in supporting somebody who might be developing, emotional well-being would certainly be deteriorating. So use of stories, sensory items, helping them make sense of what was going on, and I suppose noticing and wondering about the different emotions that somebody was going through. So it was developed as a framework, but it also needed training to go alongside it, and it was a resource to help those that were supporting people with PMLD make sense of what was going on.
You don't mention in your statement when it was developed. I'm just wondering, was...
So it was being developed, I mean, again, you know, there was the ability to get access to funding. So while they were looking at how they were supporting people with a mild to moderate learning disability, we were given some funding to help us think about what we might do with somebody with a profound learning disability. So we were developing throughout, it was probably well into the beginning of COVID, but working with family carers, with an educational psychologist, and with our specialist in sort of narrative therapy in PAMIS. So it continued to be developed throughout COVID. We didn't roll it out as we'd anticipated, because actually what we were finding was carers, both family and paid carers, they were traumatised, and it was really, really difficult. And trying to unpick that at a moment when their roles were so intense, you know, our educational psychologist and our lead felt that it wasn't the time. And also trying to find time to train staff was quite tricky at that moment. But it's been rolled out since and used with staff, just as another tool in a toolbox to help people think about how to explain things to individuals.
And that resource, as it exists today, would that be... So say there was a future pandemic, is that something that could be tweaked and used immediately, or would you need to start again?
No. I mean, it's something that we're rolling out as we speak, because I think it's really important that you give people the tools to manage. I mean, it could be used, it's a tool for trauma, you know, so it can be used at any point. So it's becoming a core part of what we offer as an organisation, and certainly make sure that every student that comes on placement with us is aware, and it just adds to some of those trauma-informed resources that have been developed.
And talking of resources that have been developed, you go on in paragraph 21 to speak highly of the PAMIS bereavement and loss training, which you say isn't provided in staff training for those people who are caring for persons with PMLD. I suppose the first question is, what is that resource?
Shall I do?
Yeah.
It's a course that is part of a suite of training courses that PAMIS has that are specifically for people with PMLD and their families and carers. This particular training course, which I've been involved in for many years, was devised, I don't know, maybe 20 or so years ago, with input from family carers, recognising that there was little or no information or advice or guidance to families about what to do when a loved one with PMLD died, or how to best support a person with PMLD if one of their loved ones died. So it covers not just the bereavement aspects of bereavement and loss, but actually it covers loss as well. And that's losses to people with PMLD are a bit different to losses for the rest of us, in that they experience loss in their lives all the time, because it's very difficult for them to distinguish the difference between a bereavement and a loss. So for many of them who live in supported accommodation, or who go to day services or school or whatever, people will, and lots of people with PMLD are supported by carers. So those people come and go all the time on a very regular basis. And so somebody with PMLD will not understand why that person has disappeared out of their life forever. So there really is no distinction between that loss and bereavement. But also there are lots of other losses that they experience. So, you know, somebody who can no longer go to a day service, for example, that's a huge loss to them. And that may result in so-called challenging behaviour. And unless it's recognised what the root cause of that challenging behaviour is, then that may well lead to distress and trauma, and a failure to address what it is that's the underlying problem that person might have. And during COVID, of course, there were bereavements, but actually there was significant loss to people with PMLD, in that, as we've spoken before on many occasions, everything in their life just stopped. So lots of people disappeared, lots of activities disappeared, their routine disappeared, and for them those losses were extreme. And those would be some of the situations that our bereavement and loss training would be able to help with. But actually, it's we have to persuade people that there is a need for that training, and the feedback that we get is always that it's extremely helpful, whether it's in a bereavement or a loss situation. And during COVID, that would have been really helpful for lots of care providers.
If it is helpful, and I'm presuming it isn't an expensive, there's no. Why isn't it provided?
Well, so we are, I mean, it's becoming more popular, but I think that it's the issue that people... So there's some new research by Mark Soames who talks about the fact that we develop our emotional and content far earlier. So a lot of people think that if you don't have cortex brain development working and functioning, you can't have emotional responses. And we've known all the way along that that's wrong. And it is wrong because it develops in the brainstem. But people don't understand that actually somebody with a profound learning disability will have an emotional reaction and does need to be supported. And I think it's back to the how do you know what you don't know? And I think people are becoming more aware and recognising that we shouldn't be saying that somebody's developing a challenging behaviour because they've got a learning disability. It's a response to something. So we are rolling. I mean, we have had far more take-up of the course. But at the moment, the real issue is that we've got a limited social care workforce. So trying to release staff to come to training that will really benefit them is really difficult. So we're trying to find more creative ways of how we can share those resources.
Thank you. Again, at paragraph 22, you say that generally reasonable adjustments should have been made in residential settings. I'm just wondering, I mean, doubtlessly there's perhaps a long list. I'm just wondering if you can give me some examples of the reasonable adjustments that you say should have been made.
Well, I guess the principal reasonable adjustment is that family carers should not have had to lose contact with their family member. And I guess, you know, it's reasonable adjustments should be made under the Equality Act, and I don't think that was given any particular credence at that time. I mean, that's a much broader subject, but to my mind, that was the principal reasonable adjustment that should have been made, and there should have been consideration made as to the well-being of people with PMLD, what the impact of the COVID restrictions would be for them and the long-term effect for them and the distress that would cause them. But actually the inflexibility around about the rules meant that those reasonable adjustments weren't made, and actually the lack of that had a huge impact and as I've already said, a huge long-term impact on them.
Yeah, and I think, you know, families provided, they weren't visitors, they provided an invaluable role in supporting both physical and mental and cognitive well-being. And we've heard more recently that in Ireland they were able to, you know, instate them as people that could visit like staff could. And we just felt that there was no adjustment made for family carers to carry on taking that role. And I think, you know, there was advice, we were talking about this the other day, advice from the government about risk assessments being taken about the mental well-being and the impact. And we're just not convinced that those were taken properly and in partnership with families, because sometimes that would have overridden the health or the risk of COVID, because, you know, people can die of isolation and loneliness, can't they?
Yeah.
No, and it's a similar argument we've heard, or position that we've heard in relation to care homes and even prisons and hospitals. But moving on to paragraph 28, you suggest that a PMLD hub should be established in every health board authority where all the specialist health and social care staff could work, which would have prevented any future harm. I suppose I'm just wondering how that would, because it might be something we put to the health boards when they give it evidence. I'm just wondering how that would work in practice, and how, if everybody was in a central hub, does that not perhaps, if staff are going out to multiple care homes and so forth, does that not involve more people interacting and risk of spread of the disease?
I think our idea, and I'll let you come in, but it is that I mean, in a lot of ways it might be a virtual hub, but I think what we were feeling is that if you have a group of practitioners, all who understand somebody with a profound learning and multiple disability, coming together and sharing their expertise, you know, the importance of this group and the understanding of the implications of the vaccine or of COVID or of isolation would be known by a wider group, which would then help vocalise what is you know, what was missed, I suppose, during COVID. So it's not necessarily that people, well, yeah, in the future it'd be great if you only had to go to one place and get all your appointments, because we know that families have to give up work when their kids become adults because they have 20 or 30 different appointments over a month that aren't coordinated. But it's that idea of bringing collective knowledge and support and expertise that would really help raise the profile, but also the understanding of how to support this very complex group of people.
Yeah. I think it's fundamental that most people with PMLD will have a range of very complex issues. So some more than others, but there is this wide range, and there isn't that. So I guess within the NHS and other organisations there are specialisms. So, for example, if you've got somebody who has complex epilepsy, then that will have an impact potentially on their bowels, on their posture. And all sorts of other things. They might be more likely to fall over. They might be more likely to hit their head against a wall. There's all sorts of implications there. They might be, if they have a urinary tract infection, for example, then there's more likelihood that they'll have seizures, and then all of that just goes round and round. But what we don't have at the moment is access to all of the people who are required to look at all of these individual things. So what happens is that family carers and care providers are left pulling all these strands together. And I thought, what we thought was that a PMLD would help to pull all those strands together, and all of the various experts could then learn from each other. So, you know, you've got a gastroenterologist talking to a dietitian, who's talking to a neurologist, who's talking to an epilepsy nurse specialist, who's talking to, you know, a speech and language therapist or whatever. But actually, and it's not just about health, it's about health, but it's also about allied health professionals and about the social care sector as well, social workers and their GPs in there. So it's about pulling all these strands together, and the best place we thought for that to happen would be in an NHS setting. So actually, if there were another pandemic, then that expertise would be in the one place.
Thank you. In terms of, you mentioned deprioritisation of day and respite services, starting at paragraph 39 of your statement, and you mentioned at paragraph 41 that when daycare reopened, that people with PMLD were being excluded in favour of other groups such as the elderly. Do you know why that was happening?
No, I mean, it was really tricky, because we did take that to a minister, because, I mean, obviously we were really alert to everything that Nicola Sturgeon was saying, and quite early on she talked about respite and day services being really important to being opened. So then we were feeding out through our networks and through the family support directors to find out whether people were getting back into day services. But it was at a time when day services, I think pre-COVID, were beginning to be reviewed. We'd had quite a lot of conversations during COVID about there's a big thing about not having a building base, but for our group, there is a need to have a safe space that has the right equipment, that has changing place toilets, that, you know, is somewhere for someone to be able to go rather than wheeling them around in inaccessible venues. So, I mean, I can't help but wonder that they were already considering how they were reducing day services. And what we noticed was when the survey came back to say, oh, we've opened all of these, we were still hearing of lots and lots of families not having access to their day services. And sometimes when you asked, it was because, well, that's where we're doing the vaccinations, or actually we were opening that up for people with dementia and older people's services. And yeah, it's questionable. And just the honesty, you know, it'd been so much better if people had just said, look, we haven't done that. But, you know, they were coming back and saying, oh, yeah, we've opened all of these. And I didn't feel that actually it was giving the Scottish ministers enough information about specifically where and how they were being opened.
And are we talking, when you're talking about that, are we talking about a local authority level?
Yeah.
Okay. And I get the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong from reading your statement, that you felt that local authorities had used the pandemic as, I use the word excuse, but a reason to reduce services that existed before pre-pandemic levels, rather than continuing to rely on just the restrictions?
It's quite difficult to believe that that isn't why they've done it, you know, because this group are probably some of the most, you know, most vulnerable, and the families, you know, we're all in this together was the term, wasn't it? And don't worry, it's only for a short period of time. And we have families 5 years on who still don't have day services and have no respite, you know, and they are, I mean, they've broken, actually, they're not even at breaking point. So it's really difficult to think that that wasn't an excuse when they were already reviewing those day service, when they were already reviewing transport. You know, there seemed to be things that slipped under, and now trying to reinstate what was there before. I don't think there's no person, I think, that we have at the moment that has what they had before the pandemic, and that wasn't great.
No, and I think I would imagine that all of that was done with the benefit of equality impact assessments. And if equality impact assessments had been carried out, then there would have been a requirement for consultation with families and other carers and care providers who would have identified that there was a very strong need for people with PMLD to have access to day services, because otherwise they're stuck in their house. They're stuck at home, and other groups in the population are not expected to do that. Other groups will have jobs, or they'll go to university or other activities. So it's not appropriate for our group to be stuck in the house and not be given the opportunity to develop and being part of their own community and to develop friends, because they don't have the capacity to make friendships themselves. They're obviously, most of them are not ever going to have a job. So actually their day service is the replacement for that, and to take that away again was a huge loss to our community. And just to confirm what you said, that many of the day services have never gone back to where they were pre-pandemic, and pre-pandemic there wasn't enough service then either.
And during the pandemic, do I understand you correctly that you're saying that some third-party organisations kept those types of services running where the local authority had shut up shop, essentially?
Yes, yeah, there were definitely examples of third sector providing that input.
But even, sorry Jenny, but even then, the level of service was much diminished to where it had been previously, and some of them were providing an outreach service into families' homes, which for some families was a lifeline, but for others it was inappropriate and intrusive. And if you didn't have a house that was big enough, or a garden or whatever, many families just declined that offer. But then, I'm talking specifically in the third sector here, but as the services opened up again, they were never opened up to the same level. And as we're probably going on to talk about transport was withdrawn as well, and so that became a huge hurdle to be overcome as well. So even then there was a better service, but it wasn't nearly at the level that it should have been, or that it had been previously.
And could I just add, I think one of the fundamental issues is that we agree with social models of care, but you need to have an understanding of the complexity of the group. So this group are not just going for respite, they're going to be developed, they're going for lifelong learning, they're going to get physio or OT, they're going to be put in the right position in the right equipment. And I think if you don't understand the complexity of their health and their cognitive development, then it's very easy to make a judgment that, well, we'll just reduce their days. But, those days for them are their lives, and their only opportunity to engage with staff who are skilled and trained. But I think quite often the assessments that are made by a profession that doesn't have all of that knowledge and understanding. And there's often disputes between health and social work about what somebody needs. And I think that joining up doesn't happen enough. And I suppose that's what we advocate all the time, is these are individuals that need to develop. You can't just cut their services off.
It might be, in your statement, you go on to changing place toilets. I'll come back to that, but it might be opportune just to move forward to the restrictions in transport, which you deal with at paragraphs 51 onwards. And you discuss the restrictions such as minibuses to take persons with PMLD to daycare, and that they didn't restart the services. I suppose my first question is, who provided those services before the pandemic?
That was local authorities for many cases, and I guess there was third sector as well.
Yes.
Okay. And where it was the third sector, was it being paid for by the local authority or by central government, the Scottish Government?
It would have been paid for as part of the hourly rate that which would have been funded by social work. So as part of somebody's package of day service, that would be funded by social work, or in some instances by Independent Living Fund. But it would be an hourly rate, and that hourly rate would be calculated to cover the cost of transport as well.
And transport also, obviously was also for education and for schools as well.
And activities.
Yeah.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Was the transport purely to go to these day centres, or was it more general in nature?
It was both. So in the main, what would happen is that the minibus would pick them up at their house or their family home or their residential accommodation. We'd take them into the day service, and the same thing would happen at the end of the day. And during the course of the day, they'd be able to go out as a group, and to be able to go some distance so that they could access what were purposeful and meaningful activities for them. So as soon as you withdraw the transport, there are then difficulties in getting somebody from their home into the day service and back again, which raised all sorts of issues around whether people had their own transport, mobility cars and so forth, or whether some people had to get taxis and escorts, which was a very expensive option. But it also meant that because they didn't have transport during the course of the day, unless they were using a mobility car, the individuals wouldn't be able to go out anywhere, and they wouldn't be able to go out as a group and have activities with their friends and peers, and so that then kind of isolated them in the building. And because of the COVID restrictions, fewer people were allowed to be in the building at any given time, which reduced the number of people that were able to access the service. So it was a kind of law of diminishing returns.
And notwithstanding the inquiries looking at a particular period of time between beginning of 2020 and the end of 2022, you say those services, those mini bus services, haven't restarted, or it's a reduced service?
For some, I mean, there was review of transport pre-pandemic, and I mean, again, it felt a bit like an excuse that they didn't restart post-pandemic. Yeah, and I mean, families were being asked to take their relative to day services, and for some people that was quite a distance, which, I mean, that then meant that they had to give up work in order to do that. I mean, it then pushes people in, particularly in this agenda, into the poverty, criteria and equality issues.
Thank you. And if we could go back in your statement now, as I said, we can have just maybe jumped slightly. You discussed changing place toilet availability in public spaces at paragraph 47 of your statement. And I wonder if, firstly, you could just explain what it actually is, what changing place toilet availability in public spaces actually is.
Yeah, so changing place toilet is larger than an accessible toilet, and it has specific equipment that meets the needs, personal care needs of an individual with complex needs, not just our group, but a wider group. So it has a changing bench, which means somebody can have their personal care needs met. It has a tracking hoist. It has a peninsular toilet, so two carers can get and help people on and off the toilet, and various other pieces of equipment. So it's quite a large area. It means that you can take the whole family in. If you're a single parent, what do you do with your younger children while you're changing the other one? And if you think about baby changing, we all accept that we need that. But what happens when your child becomes an adult and no longer fits on a baby changing bench? So for the last 20+ years, PAMIS has been campaigning for these changing place toilets because it is the only way of accessing your community. And we've had families in the past saying, can you imagine that the only toilet you can use is the toilet in your home? Where would you go, or how often would you get out? So we now have 247, maybe it's 270 changing place toilets in Scotland. A lot of money went down into England, and they are expanding. And again, it's how do you know what you don't know? People are beginning to recognise. I mean, when you say, what do you do when your child gets bigger? It makes so much sense. But because there are so limited ones, there's only so many places that people can go, or can only go out for part of the day, or they go out and they change their loved one on a toilet floor in the back of the car. It's pretty much a basic human need, really. And
you say that they were essentially unavailable during the pandemic. Is that because they're located in libraries or public buildings, or? So
many of them were in in public buildings, because they have to be now, in leisure centres. You know, a lot of them are in resource centres where, you know, so somebody might be able, if they were able to go to their resource centre, at least they could go back and get changed. And when the resource centres weren't open, then obviously people had limited access. At that stage, there were very few in open spaces, like in parks, which, you know, on a recent survey, that's exactly where families, I think particularly post-COVID, where families want to see changing place toilets. So it did really restrict, even when we opened up, where the folk that we support could go.
And in terms of the unavailability, was that restricted to the point in the pandemic where these public buildings were closed, or equally like other services, has that, or is it fully back to normal now?
So, yeah, I think it is back to normal now. And I think it was because, I mean, I did ask actually, because we were trying to find out a bit more information as we wrote the statement. It was the buildings being closed. And I think there was also a cautiousness about it being a larger area to clean if somebody went in, you know, with specific equipment, you know, that had a higher risk of then transferring COVID, how would that be maintained and cleaned? But the biggest restriction was that the buildings that they might have gone into weren't open, and the places that they wanted to go, like parks, just didn't have any at that time.
Thank you. You move on to discuss vaccinations at paragraphs 70 to 77. And you tell us in your statement that persons with PMLD were not automatically prioritised for vaccinations. And if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is care providers who are not medical professionals were making the decisions. Just a few questions about that. When you talk about care providers, what do you mean?
There was an issue.
I think it's paragraph 71. If
71, yeah.
It says instead care providers were having to make decisions about whether people with PMLD fit within the 6 priority groups, but they are not medical professionals. I suppose my question was just what you actually meant by care providers.
Yeah, so I'm trying to work that one out, but I think when we were in the initial stages, you know, people, so if you were living in residential care and you had a support worker, or you had, you know, a care provider of that 24-hour care, you know, the underlying medical conditions that fitted in those 6 priorities, which we spent a lot of time looking at, you know, that wasn't something when you were working as, you know, hands-on with no support, that you would immediately think, oh gosh, you know, Pat's daughter actually has 2 of those underlying conditions. She needs to be pushed forward with that. What was really helpful was when the government then decided that everyone within learning disabilities became a priority. And I think that was because it was so difficult to ascertain whether you fitted into that key priority area. So, you know, that was the Scottish Government civil servants working with a number of organisations, particularly third sector organisations, the lead learning disability nurse at the Scottish Government, giving advice about how to minimise, I suppose, the risk of missing people. And I think that was a really helpful decision that was made, saying that everybody with a learning disability needed to be looked at being put into the priority. What happened, though, was not everybody with a learning disability got put in, but then not thinking about the carers that were supporting them also being in that priority seemed a ridiculous idea. You know, why would you not vaccinate the whole team? Because if Pat got COVID and then was with her daughter, you know, it just didn't seem sensible.
Well, you go on to discuss that paragraph 73 and highlighting that, in your view, that families of persons with PMLD should have been vaccinated at the same time. And you go on further to say it, I think it's paragraph 74, that some local authorities permitted that and some local authorities didn't. And I'm just wondering what the mechanics of it was in relation to asking a local authority, look, can the family be vaccinated at the same time? How is that actually done?
I mean, I think in the same with everything that happens at the government, it gets dropped down to a local authority area for them to do what they feel is the most effective way of doing things. And again, it's down to how do you know what you don't know. The areas, I think, that had a really good understanding of this group, and probably where they used learning disability nurses, there was a total understanding of thinking out of the box. Well, it would make more sense and it would be far more effective to go into the home, to see that individual and vaccinate the whole family at the same time. I think, again, it's down to the specialisms within the local authorities. But personally, I think it's a big mistake. If you've got good practice, why not just share that and give a directive that says this is the way that you need to do that? We have it not only 32 different ways, but often 64 different ways of doing something that somebody's already got right in another area.
Yeah. And I guess there was also a lack of understanding, as you say, not really understanding our group and what that might mean for them, but a real lack of understanding about how accessible it was to get to a vaccination centre, how much effort you would have to put in to do that. And if you've got a person with PMLD requires 24/7 care from at least one person, so the amount of effort in actually getting them ready out of the house, into a car park, back out of the car, might have to walk for quite a long way to get to a centre where there's access, and then you've got to be in a queue with a whole load of other people, and you might have other children with you, and then you've got to go back, do the same thing on the way back, and then you've got to do the same thing when it's your turn. And what do you do if you're the person that's responsible for looking after somebody with PMLD? You then have to take them back with you, because who else is going to do that? And I guess, if you think of that, think of it in the context of if you're looking after a person with PMLD, you sometimes can't go to the toilet on your own. So in your own home, those are the things that you have to do to actually get somebody in that position to get the vaccination. And I would imagine that most families wanted to do that because they wanted to make their family member as safe as possible. It was just the logistics of that, and I don't think that anybody making the rules and being inflexible about them would really understand and appreciate the amount of effort that it took to get us there.
And setting aside all the other issues you've mentioned, that's on the assumption that you have a car. Presumably, if you didn't have a car, you were relying on the minibuses.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We've already heard about those. You mention at paragraph 78 of the statement that a GP mentioned, and please don't mention any names, individual names, that a GP mentioned a COVID treatment was available which would be suitable for persons with PMLD. But and if I understand your statement correctly, what you're essentially saying is we should have known about this. Somebody should have said something about this. Either the Scottish Government or the health boards, if I'm understanding you correctly. Moving forward, what are you proposing? Lessons for the inquiry? What are you proposing should have been done?
I mean, I felt personally guilty because I didn't know about it. It was a family that brought it to our attention, and then you think, well, what have I missed in the guidance or the evidence that was coming out? But trying to keep up to date with everything was really difficult. But it would be really useful, I suppose, to have that central hub of where you go or somebody that you can go and get that advice from. We were really lucky. The learning disability nurse at the Scottish Government was really, really helpful, and you could go and ask. But again, you needed to know what you were asking for. But when you went onto the website, the government, I think, tried their best to give you all that information, but it was almost impossible. It was impossible to keep up to date with everything. And I think we actually in the future, we have a learning disability nurse who is our health and digital lead. I think, we would also need to think about how we organised ourselves to make sure we were keeping up to date with that evidence, but actually having a central point where you go, where you know that evidence is there would have been really helpful. It goes back to the PMLD hub, though, that information would have been fed into a group of experts who then would have been able to inform us. And in a way, I shouldn't feel responsible because we're just a charity, but you felt actually at the end you were the person that was supposed to be giving the families all this information, and maybe I shouldn't take that on personally, but it was a big responsibility.
Yeah. And I guess actually reading that again, the way that we've written it suggests that the family carer got in touch with the GP and said, what about this? When in actual fact, the reality of it was that she will have spent many, many hours online trying to find more information about this. So, and she spoke to many different people before she actually got to the point where she could say to the GP, and what about this particular treatment, which she then got. But actually she was doing that while at the same time looking after her son, who is a very active person with PMLD. So she'd be holding him off with one hand on the laptop and on the telephone with another, and then she would have to get him to the GP for that treatment. So we've put that in one short paragraph, but that reflects a huge amount of time and effort and stress for that one individual family.
And she had to ask the GP rather than the GP suggesting it.
In paragraph 86, and I think we've mentioned this, but you talk about a lack of clarity in the guidance regarding supported accommodation. Is that the same point that we made, I suppose, at the beginning, that residential settings, there wasn't distinctions between different types of residential settings? A question I wanted to kind of ask you in terms of a supplementary question. In terms of guidance, the guidance to family members of a person who has PMLD, how would you describe the adequacy and clarity of that guidance?
I think it was inadequate. I mean, I think that the problem was, even when families would go and scour through the government website and come up with the information, it was then misinterpreted or it was interpreted in so many different ways. So a family would go to the own tenancy where there's a group of 4 people living and say, this is my understanding of what I've just read. And then they'd say, well, no, that's not our understanding. And this is what the rules that we're following. And it was very difficult because it was so confusing for a family carer to then say, well, I don't agree with you. And, and they were very supportive of, the carers that were having to put their lives online. So they didn't want to upset the people that were supporting their loved one, but it wasn't clear enough. And that, again, it is so much easier if you had somebody that you could go to that then, mind you, we did sometimes have people that we could go to and they would tell us something, and then it still got interpreted many different ways. Yeah. I think it would have been very helpful if we could have had clearer conversations with public health. Sometimes you'd go to public health department in a health board and one person would say one thing, and I remember a member of staff phoning up the next day just to clarify, got a different member of staff who completely contradicted what the other person had said, and that was about visiting, actually. One person said, no, I think that's totally appropriate, and then the next person said, no, it isn't.
And I suppose as an example of how that worked in practice was that our daughter, who was in a supported accommodation, her care provider took a more empathetic view of the guidance, and after 3 months, because they felt that there was an exception for her because of her deterioration in her mental well-being, and as it turned out, ultimately her physical well-being, we came up with a risk assessment that enabled us to go and visit her and for her to come and visit us. But we know from many of the families that we spoke to at that time that was very much the exception than the rule. And you used that risk assessment that we came up with on many occasions, but to no avail really. With many others of the of the families that we know of, and some of them, one in particular, we know that they didn't have access to their son for, it was around about 18 months, other than in the garden or in a gazebo or something like that, but much longer. And his residential setting was very much like my daughter's. So no reason why there should have been any difference in the treatment. But so we got to see our daughter after 3 months, and that family it was 18 months. So that was just an indication as to how the differences in interpretation of the guidance impacted on individual families.
And that mum and the dad, restricted their access to the community for 18 months in the hope that at some point they'd be allowed in. So their lives were completely narrowed down because they weren't connecting with other people, because they wanted to be COVID-free so they could go and visit their son. But, you know, the impact on their and restrictions on their lives was far greater than anybody else's.
Thank you. And Ms Miller, just to pick you up on one point, I can't find it in the statement, but I know it's there. You mentioned the inconsistent advice. The inconsistent advice wasn't from different health boards, that was within the same health board, I think you say within.
Yes. Yeah, that was, so somebody in public health agreed that the risk assessment needed to be done and this parent should go in, and then the next day I think we were querying one bit, they got somebody else and they said no, that's not what the guidance says, that can't happen. So, and
that lack, well, assume it's lack of clarity rather than individuals interpreting it, that lack of clarity, was it Scottish Government guidance or was it a health board?
So the Scottish Government guidance, I think, went down, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Public Health Scotland, yes. And then it goes down into the local health board areas, and then it's how that's interpreted. But it was that whole bit that I think that we really questioned about risk assessments, was that the risk assessment should be done with the individuals, and it was I mean, you can't cut out the whole risk, but it should have been a collaborative approach, and that was certainly when we started opening things up, how we operated, but that just didn't happen in practice. There were risk assessments, I think, done by residential settings and other organisations that had no input from families at all, who actually, let's face it, are the experts in how to manage infection control, because they've been doing it for the entirety of their son or daughter's life.
Thank you. And that really takes us on to your conclusion, which I won't read, which is found at paragraph 87 of your statement. And before, I think simply thank you for your continued assistance to this inquiry. Is there anything else either or both of you would like to add that either I haven't addressed within your statement or that has come to mind after drafting your statement?
Pat, I think you were thinking about the...
Well, there was one thing that did occur to me, because when we've been preparing this evidence and in all of our discussions about it, obviously our focus has been on the human rights and equality aspects of it, and much of what we've said today we have probably said in earlier statements and earlier evidence. But one of the things that I read really struck me, and that was looking back at the earlier guidance on the human rights issues, and it was that the European Committee on the Prevention of Torture Statement of Principles relating to the treatment of persons deprived of their liberty in the pandemic is referred to in the Scottish Human Rights Commission briefing on the 30th of March 2020 in respect of the COVID-19 emergency legislation, with specific reference to adults with incapacity and care homes. And it said that any restrictive measure taken vis-à-vis persons deprived of their liberty to prevent the spread of COVID-19 should have a legal basis and be necessary, proportionate, respectful of human dignity and restricted in time. And persons deprived of their liberty should receive comprehensive information in a language they understand about any such measures. So in the experience of people with PMLD and their families and carers, we hope that we've shown that the restrictive measures taken were not always necessary, not always proportionate, not respectful of their human dignity, went on for significantly longer than they should have, and weren't in a language that they would understand. So at PAMIS we are, and I'm sure Jenny will agree with this, we're eternal optimists, and we work really hard to bring about improvements for our community. But we would like to think that as a result of this inquiry, many lessons will be learned for the future. And we are really pleased, and I can say this on behalf of Jenny and myself, we're really pleased to have had the opportunity to tell our stories and to have been heard, listened to, and for that we're exceptionally grateful.
Well, that's very kind of you, I'm sure. Thank you both again for your continued assistance with the inquiry.
Yes, thank you on my behalf as well, and for these kind comments at the end.
Thank you.
Very good. That's all for today.
Yeah.
Monday morning now, I'm afraid.
Not for me, Tuesday. but
Tuesday for you. Okay. Some of us have got to be here all the time. Very good. Thank you.